Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 124, but just a little catch up before we get into that. Last time we met the demise of the Needle Man, who was an assassin by the recently taken over Sunderland Corporation. And so Connie Sunderland is head of that now. And she had first sent the assassin over to Tulane University because a couple of their students had broken into their mainframe and stolen a couple of secrets from them because they're trying to find dirt on companies that are hurting the environment. So, of course, the cybersecurity for the Sunderland Corporation saw who it was, where they were. So Sunderland sent her assassin, the Needle Man, to kill not only these kids, but also their professor, because as she put it, you gotta kill the plant at the roots. And the main leader of the kid group named Otter is the one who found the professor dead, and being scared and not knowing where to go, he goes to Swamp Thing's house for protection. In the meantime, the other two kids, Michelle and Spike, hear about the murder. They decide to go as well. They don't know where Swamp Thing lives. And when they stop at Chester's to get directions, Spike is killed by the Needleman assassin who had been following them. So Chester and Michelle escaped, but that was part of the Needleman's plan. He's going to follow them to Swamp Thing's house, and he does just that. So the Needleman attacks Chester just outside of Swamp Thing's house, and Swamp Thing, of course, comes out, saves Chester, and entangles the Needleman to question him. But the Needleman isn't giving up any secrets. He bites down on one of his teeth, and it turns out it was full of cyanide, so he kills himself before he could talk. And we leave that issue with Connie Sunderland saying that she knew the Needleman wouldn't do much, but it was worth a try, but also that she's got lots of assassins that she can send after Swamp Thing. And that's where we left it off. So first things first, with issue 124, we see on the cover here what looks like a Mayan priest on the top of a temple about to sacrifice a body. And I say body instead of person because this body already looks like it's been skinned or dead for a while. It's very skeletal. You can see muscles and stuff, but it just looks decayed. And the shaman is raising a knife and also pointing out his hand like he's doing a spell or something. And in the background, we get a really red sky like magics are happening. And we see Swamp Thing yelling out in pain, kind of faded in the red, as if the shaman's magics are causing Swamp Thing physical pain. And we also see that this is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Greg Baker. And we start off on page 1. It says, somewhere in Central America. In the first panel, we see a white man tied up inside of some sort of structure. And inside that structure, there is a poster that says, Sunderland, builds buildings and friends, and then it cuts off. And then we see 3 indigenous men come through the entrance, and 2 of them have machetes. One of them is holding some sort of bowl, and we are getting some narration from the middle one, who seems to be the one in charge. And the narration says, it has been a long time, so very, very long. What if the gods no longer remember us? And then the white guy sees the 3 men enter the room, and he seems like he gets pretty scared. He tries to sit up. I don't think I mentioned it, but he has a scarf in his mouth so he can't talk. But when one of the machete guys removes the scarf, the white guy yells out, look, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about what happened, but it's not my fault. I'm just a lousy field rep. I had no way of knowing what that stuff would do. You gotta believe me. But the indigenous people are not listening, and the narration continues from the lead indigenous man. What if the gods no longer exist? No, I mustn't doubt. Doubt is as deadly to the gods as this white man's lies have been to my people. So the head indigenous man who was narrating, he's the one with the bowl, and he brings that over to the white guy, and it's full of some kind of liquid, and he makes the white man drink it. And as he does, the indigenous man says in Spanish, drink this. It will help blunt the pain when the time comes. And it seems that the liquid that the white man was forced to drink was some kind of psychedelic, because all of a sudden the background of the next panel has a lot of psychedelic colors that are in a wave pattern behind the indigenous men. And also those indigenous men have gone from wearing modern day clothes and holding machetes to wearing what looks like traditional Mesoamerican ceremonial garb, which consists of lots of fabrics that are orange and yellow, and also a lot of gold stuff. I don't know if it's actually real gold, but they have a lot of gold jewelry, and they all have headdresses that have gold on them. And that gold is in the shape of skulls and animal bones. And the headman's narration continues. Surely the gods will not ignore our plea for help. They must hear our prayers. They must. Then we cut to another indigenous man that we haven't seen yet, and we see him walking through a village and out near a cornfield. And in that cornfield, we do see like one of those Mayan step pyramids. And his narration is saying, I do not want this. I am no shaman, no sorcerer, despite my heritage. I may have spent years at the missionary school, but I am far from a wise man. I am a farmer, as my father and his father before him. My family has not trafficked with gods and demons for hundreds of years, but sometimes a man must do what he would rather not do if he is to remain a man. I can only pray that I remember the right words, the proper invocations. And as he says this last line, we see him walk into some sort of hut, and there is a chest in there, and when he opens the chest, we see that there is some sort of golden ceremonial mask. And the narration continues. These things must be done correctly if humans would beg favors from the god, especially one as important and temperamental as Hipetotec, the flayed god. Then we cut to Swamp Thing's house somewhere in Terrebonne Parish, and we see that Lady Jane is playing with baby Tefe. She's growing a hand out of plants and vines that is picking Tefe up and throwing her around. And Abby is sitting on the porch enjoying watching this, and she says to Lady Jane, I swear, Tefe's growing like a weed. And Lady Jane answers, somehow that seems appropriate. And we also see that Swamp Thing is standing on the porch next to Abby, and Abby says to him, our baby's growing up, Alec. Pretty soon she'll be a proper little girl. It's strange to realize in a couple of years she'll be ready for kindergarten. And Swamp Thing answers, everything has its seasons. But then Swamp Thing pauses for a second, and he says, Did you hear that? And Abby says, hear what? And Swamp Thing answers, I thought I heard someone call my name. And he's yelling out because all of a sudden his body begins to explode. His skeleton that is made of plants and stuff is ripping out of his body, and it looks like it is very painful. And of course, Abby is standing there watching this, and she says, Alec? Then we cut to somewhere, we don't know where, and we see there are 3 cobs of corn on top of the seat of a stone chair. And all of a sudden, Swamp Thing's body begins to grow out of these corns. And when his body is done growing, he says, where am I? And then in the next panel, we get a pull away shot where we reveal the whole scene. And we see that he just grew from a chair that was on top of one of these pyramids. There are lots of indigenous people looking up at Swamp Thing and praying to him and worshiping him. And then we see a man wearing that same ceremonial mask that the man had gotten out of the trunk before. And that man is on the top right next to that stone chair that Swamp Thing grew out of. And he is on his knees, also seemingly worshiping Swamp Thing. And he says in Spanish, he has come. Hipetotec has heard our prayers. The flayed god is here. And the other indigenous people are chanting and cheering for this. And we see the name of this issue is called Husks. So Swamp Thing takes a look at this scene and kind of takes it in for a second and then says, who are you? How did you bring me to this place? And the man says in Spanish, I am Carlos, a son of those who once served you. And Swamp Thing looks at him and says, I do not speak Spanish. And then we get a panel that's kind of a closer view of this priest that's kneeling down in front of Swamp Thing that was speaking to him. And he begins to talk in English, but the creepy thing is it looks like he's wearing a skin suit, like literally like Leatherface or something. And I don't know if it's just a skin suit, but he looks extra crazy in this panel. And I think it's because he's laughing. As he says in English, I am not surprised the gods speak English. Everyone else in positions of power seems to. As I said, I am Carlos, a descendant of the priests who once served you, Lord Hipe, in the old days. And as to how I summoned you to this place, we made a blood sacrifice in your name. And then he points to an altar off to their side, and we see that there is a flayed human body on top of it. And Swamp Thing is taken aback by this. He says, you killed a man in cold blood to bring me here? And then I guess because the ceremony is over, the priest takes off his mask and headdress, and we see that for sure the skin that he's wearing is the white guy from the beginning, because it's got the same hairstyle and color of hair as that man. And the priest doesn't understand why Swamp Thing would care about him killing someone, and he says, I do not understand, Lord Hipe. Is that not how it has always been when the sons of man wish to petition the Lord of the Corn? And Swamp Thing looks at him and says, I do not know who or what you think I am, but I am not this Lord Hipe. And the priest looks at him with despair and says, "But you must be. How else could you have heard our prayers, been summoned by our sacrifice?" And I gotta say, it is very unsettling the way that the skin suit looks on this man. The artist did a really good job in this issue. It's just super creepy and weird looking. So Swamp Thing answers the man saying, "What could be so important that you would sacrifice an innocent life just to bring me here?" And then the priest makes a sweeping gesture with his hand towards the land surrounding the pyramid, and he says, "This is why I called you, Lord Hipe." And then he pulls a backpack out from the white man that he had killed, and he says, "As far as the Anglo, he was not innocent." And then we see there is a symbol on this backpack, and it's a big S symbol. And Swamp Thing sees the bag and the symbol, and he says, "I am familiar with this corporation." And then we get a little flashback picture image of Swamp Thing looking at the Sunderland toxic waste dumping facility. And in the clouds of this image, there is the face of Connie Sunderland looking over the toxic waste factory. And Swamp Thing says to the priest, "You are right. They are far from innocent." And then Swamp Thing looks over at the plant life and the grounds surrounding the pyramid, and we see that there's a bunch of dead corn, and it looks like the stalks are falling over and rotting, and Swamp Thing asks, "How did this happen?" So then the priest recounts what happened with that white guy who came into the village, and we're seeing little panels of him coming in and stuff, and over these panels his narration is saying, "It began when the Anglo first came to our village 4 years ago. He said that his company and our government had made an agreement. Our villain had been chosen to test a new form of fertilizer. He told us we were very lucky. He assured us that the new fertilizer would double our crop yield. We would never again have to worry about having enough to eat." And we see in the panels the white guy's being nice to all the indigenous people. He's giving them all Sunderland shirts that say, "Sunderland, we put you first." And then we get another panel of the fertilizer being unloaded from the trucks, and it has a poison symbol. And we see the men unloading it are definitely wearing some crazy high protective hazmat suits. And then the narration continues. "The first year, it was exactly how the Anglo had promised, as was the year after that." And in this panel, we see an indigenous father with his son on his shoulders as they walk through the cornfields, and the cornfields are blossoming and blooming. They're so thick they can barely walk through them, and they look very happy. Then we turn the page and we see the next year, the corn is all dead and nothing's growing, and the narration says, "Then came the third year. The rich soil that had served my father and all his fathers before him was little more than sand. Our livestock began delivering horribly malformed offspring, and we soon discovered the curse was not limited to pigs and cows." So in these panels, we're seeing that a cow is giving birth to a deformed calf that has like 6 legs, and it also has some kind of opening in its chest cavity where its innards are spilling out. And then we see a panel of a human baby that has been born with very bad deformities in its head and face, and also in its arms. It looks like some fingers tried to grow on the baby's biceps, and that's where the arms stop. And the super messed up part is the baby is actually wearing one of those Sunderland shirts that says, "We put you first." Then we get a panel of the priest praying, and his narration continues. "We prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe for intervention, but nothing came of it. Finally, we sent a delegation of elders to the capital to beg the government to help us. They never returned." And then we see in this panel that the government just killed these men that the villagers sent and threw them in a mass grave pit. So then we see that the priest and the other indigenous people are gathered around a fire, and the narration continues. "We were desperate. Our crops had failed, our children were starving, neither church nor state was willing or able to help us. What could we do? It was decided we had no choice but to rely on the ways of our forefathers. We would seek help from the old gods, and I was chosen to serve as the priest. To summon the aid of the gods calls for the surrender of a life. How could I demand that of one of my friends, possibly one of my own family, to make such a sacrifice?" Then we get a panel of the white guy driving up in the Jeep, and the narration continues. "Luckily, I was not forced to make that decision. You know the rest." And then the priest removes the human skin face from his face, and it's kind of like he rolls it down like if he was wearing a wetsuit or something, but it's a skin suit. And he asks Swamp Thing, "Will you help us?" as he points to the fields of corn. And Swamp Thing takes a minute and he kind of looks around and he thinks to himself, "What should I do?
Do I leave these people to suffer the consequences of their government's corruption and Sunderland's greed? Or do I honor a contract that dates back beyond recorded history?
And the main thing he's looking at and questioning is the dead body of the flayed white man. But it seems he figures that man was an evil person because he looks at the priest and he says, yes. So Swamp Thing has decided to help them, and Swamp Thing doesn't waste any time now that he's agreed to help. He walks straight out into the cornfield, and tendrils begin to grow out of his body and burrow into the ground so he can feel how bad the damage is. And his narration says, the damage is severe but not irreparable. I have dealt with worse. Before I can repair the damage done to the soil, I must first draw out the poisons. So Swamp Thing begins to concentrate, and we can see his vines growing deep into the earth, and we're getting a cool like cross-cut section of the ground so we can see what it's digging into. And it's kind of cool because we can see dinosaur bones like a T-Rex skull that is in the ground underneath where he's standing. And Swamp Thing's thinking continues.
There is so much toxin concentrated in such a confined space. I don't know if I can maintain this shell and still.
And then all of a sudden, Swamp Thing yells out in pain as it looks like his body begins to turn purple from poisoning. And the priest yells out, Lord Hipe, is something wrong? And then Swamp Thing is pulled into the earth. And then the indigenous people and the priest just kind of stand there staring for a while. They don't know what to do. And then all of a sudden, a small rumbling begins to grow under their feet in the ground. And then it looks like the priest looks in the distance and he sees a mountain, which might be a volcano, and it looks like there's some kind of black smoke coming out of it. And as he looks at this mountain, all of a sudden, corn stalks begin to shoot out of the ground surrounding the indigenous people, and all of the ground surrounding them becomes green. So of course, all the indigenous people start celebrating and cheering, and the priest bends down to look at one of the small corn stalks that's growing, and he says out loud, saved, we're saved. And then another indigenous person yells out, Carlos! And when we turn the page, we see an indigenous man who's in tattered clothing. It looks like he's been running for a very long time, and he's running towards Carlos, and he's saying, Carlos, there are soldiers in the village. They're looking for the Anglo. And just as he reaches Carlos, he gets hit in the back with a bullet, and he falls into Carlos's arms. And Carlos yells out, Santos! So as Santos said, the government is here looking for the Anglo, meaning the white guy that they killed. And Carlos, who is the priest, is wearing that man's skin still all over his body. So we see some commando-looking guys. They actually look like they were probably referenced from Predator or something because everybody's got their own style of gun. But the leader of this mercenary group says, shoot them if they make any moves at all. I don't care if it's just to scratch their nose. And in the next part that he says, he uses some racist language that I'm not going to say in this podcast, but I'll replace the words with something mean but not racist. So the leader yells out to the indigenous people, okay, you pig-ignorant bastards, what the hell did you want with Walter Kramer? And as the commander scans the indigenous people as he asks this question, he eventually gets to Carlos, who is kneeled down on the ground holding the dead body of Santos. And the commander looks at Carlos and sees that he's wearing the skin of Walter Kramer, and he says, oh my God, Wally? So the commander turns to his men and says, those murdering barbarians, shoot them! And one of his guys asks, all of them, senor? And the leader says, you heard me, Lieutenant. So the men begin opening fire with their automatic weapons on the indigenous people who are standing there, and it's a massacre. It doesn't look like any of the indigenous people survived, and the commander goes over to the bodies and he just steps on top of them, almost like he's going up a hill or something, but there's just a mound of bodies, and he says, disgusting, to think that they had sunk to the level of human sacrifice. Lieutenant, have these fields torched, and while you're at it, set fire to what's left of the village. And just as he says that, all of a sudden, the mound of bodies begins to heave, and Swamp Thing bursts from the ground below them. And he is pissed. He yells out, what have you done? And the commander doesn't know what to do, so he just yells, shoot it! Shoot it! But Swamp Thing begins to grow, and he says, murderers! And it seems like he's about to attack, but out of nowhere, a man comes that I guess it was with the military, and he's wearing a flamethrower. So he begins spraying Swamp Thing with fire, and it doesn't do much, but it does catch Swamp Thing's hand on fire. But Swamp Thing is so gigantic now, basically a human can fit in the palm of his hand. So as he begins walking towards the men, he's just kind of grunting and growling, and then inside his head, he's thinking,
What is happening to me?
and it seems like he's been overcome by some sort of spirit, almost like he's being controlled by something. His body even begins to grow what looks like the ceremonial garb of the indigenous priest and people. So the military guys take one look at this giant swamp thing walking towards them, and they jump in their truck and they leave. And the only one who doesn't is the commander. And he's looking back at them as they drive away, shaking his fist, yelling, "Cowards! Come back and fight that damn thing like I tell you! Come back! It's only a trick!" And as he says this last line, we see the giant hand of Swamp Thing hovering above the commander's body. And it looks like maybe Swamp Thing could kill him or smash him, but he does not. Swamp Thing just picks the man up and looks at him. And while Swamp Thing's body is staring, in his mind he's thinking,
There is power locked in this blood-soaked earth. Nothing I do is impossible. Nothing I desire forbidden. When I shrug my shoulders, the earth shall rock like a child's cradle. When I clear my throat, volcanoes erupt. Is this what it feels like to be a god? Am I a god? Am I Hipe Totec, the flayed god?
And then Swamp Thing kind of snaps back to reality after having that moment, and he's looking at the commander in his hand, and the commander, of course, is weeping and crying in fear, and Swamp Thing looks at him and thinks,
No, as lonesome as this insect may be, it is not for me to kill him.
And as Swamp Thing sits him down, the commander says, "See, what I tell you, it's just a trick." And then Swamp Thing shrinks down to his normal body size, and his thoughts continue.
Their lifeblood courses through me, infusing me with their strength. It is intoxicating, almost like a drug. Is this how the ancient peoples of the world trafficked with the elementals they mistook as gods? And if that is true, what am I in danger of becoming?
So Swamp Thing begins to walk over to a truck that's labeled Sunderland, and the commander is on the ground in front of him, and it seems maybe his mind has broken because he's just pointing at Swamp Thing saying, "Trick, trick, trick." And as Swamp Thing walks, he's thinking,
First things first, I must get to the bottom of this madness.
So he looks through the stuff that's inside of this truck, and there's like a briefcase with papers, and the narration says,
So much pain, so much suffering, so much waste. There must be a reason.
And as he examines the papers from the briefcase, he sees one that says, Classified Project Cornucopia. So Swamp Thing reads the files behind this one, and he thinks,
The jargon is familiar to the part of me that was once Alec Holland, research biologist. The duplicity is not. The chemicals tested on Carlos's village were a slow-acting form of defoliant. Sunderland's plan was to sell the poison to the U.S. government, who would see that it was shipped to the coca growers in South America. It was just another guerrilla battle in the war on drugs.
And then he looks up from the papers and he sees the indigenous people's village in the distance burning. He's also looking around at all the dead indigenous people that have been shot by the military people, and even the commander who's still yelling trick at Swamp Thing. And he sullenly asks the question,
What harm could it do?
And then Swamp Thing looks down at the papers again and he thinks to himself,
What should I do? Who is accountable for this tragedy? Whom do I punish? Or is punishment even mine to met out?
And then he hears a noise in the sky and he looks up and thinks,
What?
And he sees fighter jets flying overhead, and one of them is saying, Firebird to nest. I've got the village targeted. Over. And a person responds over the radio, Roger, Firebird. Any sign of guerrilla activity? Over. And the fighter pilot looks down at the ground and he sees all the dead bodies and the commander pointing at Swamp Thing. And he says, Not that I could see. Wait, I see something. Looks like two people standing on the road. Over. And the person on the comms responds, Roger, Firebird, drop your eggs. But Firebird hesitates, saying, But, and he's cut off by the comms person saying, Just do it, Firebird. So Firebird goes along with it and he drops his bombs. And Swamp Thing is watching the planes fly over and the bombs fall. And before they hit, he's thinking,
The power of the governments and corporations is nothing compared to the strength I hold within myself. I could topple this country's corrupt government In the space of an afternoon, I could bring their army to its knees in a matter of hours, but Sunderland might prove a bit riskier.
And then the bombs hit, but it looks like they're more like napalm because there's no giant explosion. It's more of a giant fire. And I don't think I said it, but Swamp Thing and the commander definitely got hit by these because there's a panel where the bombs are like a second or a millisecond from hitting them. And Swamp Thing is just looking at it peacefully while the commander is looking at it like he can't believe what's happening. So Swamp Thing's thinking continues.
I do not hesitate out of fear for myself. While I can regenerate my body countless times, the same cannot be said for those I hold dear to me. They are trapped within the fragile blossoms of flesh.
And then we see Swamp Thing has regrown his body and he's now standing on top of the pyramid and he's thinking,
it would be unfair of me to place their lives at risk in order to salve my conscience. Yet justice must be done. Carlos and his people must be avenged. But how?
And Swamp Thing still has the papers from the briefcase in his hands, and he thinks for a second, and he gets a very clever looking look on his face. Then we cut to the Daily Planet in Metropolis, and we see a mail truck pull up and a mailman walk in and deliver the mail to the mailroom. And Swamp Thing's narration is over these panels saying,
when Alec Holland was a graduate student, a professor once told him, true wisdom is knowing when and what to delegate to others. And that is what I have chosen to do.
Then we see the guy in the mailroom at the Daily Planet looking through the mail, and he's separating it on his cart, and then he begins to deliver it to all the different journalists and people at the Daily Planet. And the narration continues.
This situation demands something other than ancient magic and forgotten rituals. This is a job for the Fourth Estate.
And I've never heard the press called that before, but I guess journalism or the press in general is known as the Fourth Estate. And we see that the guy from the mailroom is throwing an envelope on top of Clark Kent's desk, who you might know as Superman. So we're assuming that Swamp Thing has sent Superman the documents that he had about Project Cornucopia. And hopefully this will put Clark Kent / Superman on the misdeeds of the Sunderland Corporation. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.